It's almost hard to judge what it attracts, but it seems to be
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay, my name is Nick Rampos. I am the Director of Community Alternative Programs at the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments in Washington, D.C. I'm also the Chair of the Transportation Domain Management Institute, which is probably sponsoring this session here at ACT. We were incorporated back in 1982, and we were originally part of ACT, and we worked very closely with ACT. We are a separate entity. We do have four board officers and 11 board trustees. It's probably an easier way to do this. Our mission is to establish TDMI as an international TDM sustainable transport umbrella group. We're basically into facilitating information and innovation in TDM, and we'd like to provide educational opportunities to the TDM community, not only here in the United States, but across the globe. So eventually, we have planned other sessions in other parts of the world. We recently did a session out at the European Conference on Mobility Management, but we're going to do similar sessions, such as the one that we're hosting today. And we're also looking at existing research that's out there and compiling it and making it easily accessible in one location. We do have a website. It's transportation2.org. We have resource links to existing research that's out there. We also have a social media platform, and we also have tied in to a lead module that's now available. Some of you may have gone to the sustainability session yesterday. Justin Shore and Becky Schwartz are leading that effort up, and it allows for folks that are looking to get lead certification to find resources in the TDM arena to be able to get those points. So with that, I want to basically start off with our session. And our first speaker for today's session on shared use mobility is Rick Hutchinson. Rick is the Chief Executive Officer of City Carshare here in San Francisco. It's the largest nonprofit car sharing organization in North America, and he brings more than 30 years of leadership experience to the sustainable transportation marketplace. During his career, he has led 3 companies. He's headed subsidiaries and divisions of major public corporations and consulted in a range of industries and specialties. He joined City Carshare in 2005. Currently, Rick is responsible for all aspects of City Carshare organization, including strategic direction, organizational functions, and organizational development. He also serves on the board of directors of City Carshare. Rick.
Well, good morning, everyone. This is a packed room. I hope if it gets too hot, we can all stand up and take off our coats, but I'm waiting for you to do that first. Let's get this up here. Okay. You know, we had great We had great weather in San Francisco until about halfway through last. How do we get this up here?
Yeah.
Does that work?
Yeah.
Now what? Anyway, how many people are from the area here? So you remember how great it was up until about and then this conference came to town basically and it got.
It's what we do, Rick.
All right. Back button, great. All right. Well, I have about 15 minutes, I think, and I'm going to go through some information both on shared mobility. I'm going to focus primarily, though, on cars and the aspect of what we call the transportation ecosystem that is based on shared use of cars. I'm not ignoring the rest. You'll see how we look at it, but this is primarily going to be about car sharing and its related services as well. City Carshare, as was mentioned, is a nonprofit. We take a look at the world basically from a mission-based point of view. We look at all kinds of aspects of what's livable in cities. We look at sustainability. We look at the idea of what makes a place a better place to live. And so how we build housing, streets, and places of work are going to and already have started adapting to the shared mobility movement. I call it a movement because I work for a nonprofit and I can call it a movement, but it's actually, since most of the movement is for-profit entities, there's a lot of philosophical and even operational differences, and I'll try to highlight a few of those things as we go along. So this is what we look at as the transportation ecosystem, but the way we define this is not so much the little silos you see here. Basically, we have 8 different groupings of shared mobility services that you would have access to in an urban environment. Up until about 10 years ago, you wouldn't have seen it like this. In fact, I've left some out. Most of what you see in today as far as shared mobility is concerned is relatively new. In fact, you wouldn't have seen most of this even 2 years ago, or some of this 2 years ago. So we look at there effectively being alternatives, all of this being an alternative to driving a single occupancy vehicle or a personal vehicle. So shared mobility has a lot to do with how do you take advantage of more, how do you leverage assets that already exist, how do you reduce the amount of assets, meaning cars, that are being produced or being put out, that are being driven on our roads. So we see this ecosystem really as being based on multiple types of, again, shared mobility, but different ways of getting around. So if you look at the circle, because they all interact, you might think of an urban environment as being a place where there might be more of an emphasis on ride sharing, for example, in one area, more walkable cities in another region. Public transit is pretty great here, in spite of what you may have experienced a couple times in San Francisco, but it is pretty great here. In some areas of the country, some areas of North America, not so great. So we would look at this ecosystem basically as all the services that are necessary to get people from one place to another, to get them to work, to get them to where they live, and to get them get around a region. What's in the middle there is how most shared mobility firms talk about what their impact is, because it's more than just getting people from one place to another. It's also about what's the impact of that. So here comes the commercial part, but I'm going to tell you a few things that I think are important for us to consider when we look at the growth of shared mobility. So first of all, City Carshare, we've been around about 14 years. We are the largest nonprofit car sharing organization in North America. There aren't that many of us left. We work very closely with other car sharing organizations around the world, actually. We've actually helped start some car sharing along with my friend Sharon over there around, actually in Europe and in North America. We only operate, though, here in the Bay Area. Although we've developed technology that's used by more car-sharing organizations in North America than any other technology, and we license that out, we primarily are an operator here. We do have the greenest fleet in the industry. I'm happy to say that. I will explain that to you if you want more information on that. And we also have initiated and innovated certain programs that are around this concept of equity. I'll show you a couple of ideas on that too. We're pretty happy with our impact. Since we launched, we've helped save over 650 million pounds of CO2. Every single day, I love this next one, every single day on Bay Area roads, 75,000 fewer miles are driven because of city car share. That's just us. So it doesn't include the other providers, and there are a lot of them, which you'll see in a little bit. And a few years ago, we set a goal of helping save our members $1 billion over the cost of car ownership by 2020. And we're well on our way to doing that last year, based on a study done previously by UC Berkeley. It would say that we helped save, and by AAA, by the way, it would say that we helped save our members $100 million last year over the cost of owning a car. We're an advocacy group too, and so we work on policy, we work on various programs. We, very proud to say, I don't think Jason's still in the room, but Sharon and I and a few others helped get car sharing for the first time into the last transportation bill in MAP 21, made it eligible for certain funds, but also it helped start a definition. And as we will see as we go forward, shared mobility is a lot about definition right now. We have the largest plug-in electric vehicle program in the country. We have had more people use electric vehicles here in the Bay Area than in 3 out of the top 15 urban environments in this country. We have several programs based around low and moderate income communities, families, seniors, students. Those are the kinds of things that many service providers are attempting to do today, and part of being a nonprofit is we get to pound on it a little bit more than some of the others. I wanted to highlight these 3 programs. These are all shared use mobility programs that we've innovated. One of them is called DASH, that's the electric vehicle program. It's a partnership with Toyota. One of them is called e-bike. This is a program we're launching, and Susan, who you'll hear from next, is going to be studying it over the next 3 years. It's the electric bike sharing program. And the other one is Access Mobile. Access Mobile is the only wheelchair accessible vehicles in the shared use mobility space, or the car sharing space today. And the reason I want to highlight these are all 3 of these systems require changes in the way we look at how we place vehicles in the city, infrastructure needs, what the cost is of building that infrastructure, and in establishing policy and process. And process is important. It's not just policy, it's then how does that policy get implemented in order to make sure we're serving as many constituencies as possible. The DASH program is meant to put electric vehicles not just into dense urban environments, which is where most of shared mobility has gone, but also to get it out into the region. So we're actually putting electric vehicles out at a campus location out in Pleasanton. Pleasanton's about 40 miles from here, about 35 miles actually, to the east. And we're testing with Toyota, how can we get more people to get on shuttles, to carpool, to get to these locations without their own personal vehicle, but have a way of getting around out there in as green a way as possible. E-bikes is meant to move people out of cars. Electric bikes are meant to coexist with car sharing. So when you're making a trip around a city, especially a city like San Francisco where there's a few hills and some old guys like me can't take our regular bike around all the time, e-bikes is meant to say, hey, here's a choice. For this trip, I actually don't have to get into a car. And we'll talk, I'll be happy to talk more about that later. Both of those require infrastructure. They require good ways of getting around. You need a bike infrastructure in the city to do it, and they need a place to live. And because with shared mobility, often you do not own the place where the vehicle lives, you need to work with both cities on policy and with individual or private owners as well. The same thing goes with Access Mobile. There is a lack of services for the disabled community in the shared mobility space. It's expensive. You have to place these vehicles in the right places. They have to be near transit so people can get to them, or so that someone can get to them and drive to pick up the person who needs the wheelchair. This is a very small but important concept, because it's not just about making sure all constituencies are served, it's also about making sure the way we look at the city of the future accommodates all the residents and people working as well as visitors.
Rick, can you define that a little bit better before we go on? Sorry.
Which one?
The Access Mobile.
So Access Mobile is a wheelchair accessible vans. We have 4 of them here. They are in a car sharing network, so anybody who's a member can use that van for any purpose. But we have a very specific program where someone who is physically disabled can self-identify. So even if they don't have a driver's license because they're not physically able to drive the vehicle, or for other reasons won't be able to, they can still become a member like anybody else. And then we allow them to put as many aides or help or family members on the account as necessary, who can then have access, and it's all billed to the person who is the member. So that's how the program works. We primarily have these at BART location, or near a BART location right now, because people need to see how they can get to them.
Quick question, is it working?
You know, we're going to go ahead and hold off on
Sorry.
questions
Okay.
because we're recording the session and we're going to need to, move through the presentation. Okay, thanks.
We'll have some time. Technology and innovation. So one of the things that has been very important in the shared mobility space is the use of technology, and we're going to jump on that in a second. These are the players in shared use mobility sector today. On my left, your left too, there's a list of the various services that we would consider part of shared mobility. What I'm going to focus on here, though, is really the car-based ones. So that would be traditional car sharing, it would be one-way car sharing, it would be what is called the TNCs, Transportation Network Companies, or some people call it P2P ride sharing, and it would be, which one did I miss? Peer-to-peer car sharing. There's the list. Now I want to make one other point, because you're going to hear from Susan a little bit, and Susan's going to tell you about some of the research that has been done. But one of the problems that exists today, and this is our fault because of how we've worked with the media, it's how we've worked with policymakers, is that people don't always understand what the definition and the differences are on these various services. So I just want to say real point blank, very definitively, that there's only one model of car sharing that actually has a body of research that shows its efficacy. And that's what we call classic car sharing. It's the round trip model. Doesn't mean other models aren't having a positive impact, doesn't mean that they're not doing great things. But there is not a body of research. We're only starting now to see some of the research. So when we look at any of these models, and we look at it from the point of view that all of these models that use a car require the use of the public right-of-way and the public good, that there is a connection with the community and with the cities that requires a certain amount of net benefit that isn't just providing a service. You can't provide these services without access to the public right-of-way. Therefore, there needs to be, if you're using it, there needs to be some value that goes to the community. I put bike sharing, electric bike sharing down there because I think they're an integral part of supporting the 4 services above as well. And as they grow, particularly in urban environments, they're going to become a much, much more important aspect of how we build our streets and how we learn where to place these assets, including the bikes. So here's a matrix. It's kind of busy. I apologize for that. On the left is the benefits, excuse me, that are often talked about for shared mobility. I've listed the 4 Models we talked about, and as you can see, classic car sharing is the only one I mentioned that has significant research, and you can see its impact. And different organizations, I said definition matters, different providers of shared mobility do have a different impact, and I'll show you one example of that in a second. One-way car sharing and peer-to-peer car sharing appear to be the next two that we're gaining some research on. In fact, Susan is doing some very specific research on these areas. It'll only be the first or second pieces of research on this. We need to have more. One of the biggest problems cities are facing today is a lack of data from all the providers of these services out there. If cities can't get the information and these services are asking for access to the public good and the public right away, many cities are saying, you got to give us data. You got to tell us how this is impacting things. And that's causing some issues. Okay. Just real quickly, the logos there are just examples. There are a lot of them, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what they are. The only one you might not know sort of is Flight Car. Flight Car is relatively local. It's a peer-to-peer car sharing model where when you're going to the airport, you drop off your car, they take it, they wash it, they rent it out to somebody flying into the airport, and when you come back, you don't pay for parking and you get a free car. So that's what Flight Car is. So it's a peer-to-peer one. The other thing I wanted to highlight here real quickly, and then I'll move on, is user convenience. Convenience is king. Convenience, how easy it is to get access to a vehicle or a mode of transportation, how well the technology works, what it does for your specific need, is the #1 driver of people going to any of these services. Okay? Not cost, not environmental impact, it's convenience. We believe that the purpose of shared mobility is to reach many of the goals you see over there on the right. Okay. We have a particular focus at City Car Share on environmental benefits. We also believe very much in better land use. In the city of San Francisco, it costs between $30,000 and $50,000 to build a parking spot. That's what it costs. If that parking spot isn't needed, it can go to more housing, more green space, etc. California also has something unique we can talk about later, I won't go into it, but some requirements for cities to meet certain environmental and other social related goals by a certain time. And that's SB 375 and AB 32 requirements. So it's very, very important that we find multiple ways of reducing our environmental impact. So where does shared mobility operate? Primarily today you will see this in urban environments, and in fact in dense urban environments where there's a lot of people who are working or living. It's been tough for anybody to get out of into suburbia, quite frankly, or exurbia, or even into regional areas and find a way to make it pencil out. It's expensive to offer these services, and so it's been very, very difficult. I think technology is starting to change some of that. I think some of the peer-to-peer models, which are focused right now almost only on urban environments, will work out in outside of cities like San Francisco, but that's not happening yet. Okay. These are all the people operating in San Francisco. So you have lots of options while you were here. This is actually in the Bay Area. And in fact, there's more shared mobility companies based here than in any other region in the world. Okay. So you should have no problem getting around without a car, without a personally owned vehicle here. But there is a challenge, and that is maintaining the environmental and social benefits that should come from shared mobility. And we're not necessarily seeing it all. This is a very busy chart, but what I'm about to show you is the outcome of it. This is based on EPA data that looks at the various fleets for car sharing. So we looked at City Car Share here, we looked at other Bay Area car share organizations, we looked at Chicago and Philadelphia as well, and we looked at what the EPA said that the fuel efficiency and emission efficiency of their fleets were. So the question we came up with, in order to save 1.5 million pounds of CO2, how many cars do those various fleets need? And this is very important because there is a difference between how car sharing is playing out in different communities. And there's the answer. Based on the greenness of fleets, we need 430 cars approximately to save 1.5 million pounds of CO2. It takes Zipcar almost 1,100, and it takes Enterprise about over 700. And that has to do just very objectively on how green the fleets are in those areas. The more cars, the more driving, the more parking is needed, the more congestion you have. And what's coming? Well, we have autonomous cars, going to be very important. It's going to change the way cities are built and the way we literally look at how we get around. Fuel cell cars are coming next year. There's going to be a lot of infrastructure changes if fuel cell cars come. What you have on the lower left there is something called iRide. It's effectively a three-wheel covered motorcycle. It's being tested by Toyota in various locations. And then I couldn't leave Elon Musk out of here because he thinks we will be flying around in tubes. If he can take us to space, he probably can get us to do that too. And I think I'll end here. These are just some examples that are operating in Toyota City and now in Geneva of connected cars with connected cities. These are cars talking to each other or vehicles talking to each other. They are cities talking with vehicles as well. It's happening, it's being tested now. We're trying to get them to come and do it here. And so I'll just leave you with that. Again, how we build housing, streets, and places of work will need to adapt to shared mobility, autonomous cars, alternative fuel vehicles, and connected on-demand transportation. That's going to have a major impact on the way we live in our cities. And that's it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Next up, we have Susan Shaheen. She is an adjunct professor and co-director of the Transportation Sustainability Research Center at UC Berkeley. Dr. Shaheen is a co-director of the Transportation Sustainability Research Center of the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Berkeley. And she's also an adjunct professor in civil and environmental engineering at UC Berkeley. She's an international leader in shared use mobility research. She has studied this topic since the mid-1990s and has designed and run numerous pilot programs. Her expertise includes car sharing, bike sharing, and ride sharing. She has authored 51 journal articles and over 100 reports and proceedings, 3 book chapters, and co-edited 1 book. Her research projects on car sharing, smart parking, and older mobility have received national awards. She is the mother of 2 boys with a passion for cars, trucks, trains, buses, and dinosaurs. Welcome, Susan.
Odd, but all right, good morning everyone. Thanks so much, Nick, for the introduction and including my boys in that. So they wanted to come this morning, but I decided probably not a good idea. So I'm going to talk a little bit about car sharing and bike sharing and some of the research we have done at UC Berkeley on this. I'm going to cover definitions a little bit to reinforce some of Rick's points, and also talk about growth in the marketplace and how it's changing because it is shifting, and Rick discussed that quite a bit. I'll also talk about some of the groundbreaking work I think we've done in car sharing and continues to be used in setting public policy. Then I'll move into bike sharing. It also has a range of different models and definitions, and talk a little bit about the size of the marketplace today. And then discuss some very new research findings we have in bike sharing, and then conclude with some list of our related research topics that we have at TSRC right now. So these are in the space of car sharing. I think Rick mentioned all except for the fractional ownership idea, which really hasn't been brought into existence yet, but I think holds a great deal of promise. The first is this round trip model. City Car Share, of course, is in this particular space, and this is when people actually take a vehicle into and out of the same location. They typically pay by the hour and mile. Peer-to-peer car sharing is similar in its style in terms of it typically being used in a round trip setting. But what differs about it is people are actually placing their own private vehicles into the car sharing fleet. One-way or point-to-point car sharing services. You can see a little picture here of the Car2Go vehicle. I think Car2Go is actually with us here today and a sponsor of the event. They are providing a service that's a little bit different, and it allows people to go from one location to the next. And it doesn't require a round trip. They can take round trips with these vehicles, but the majority of trips are actually point to point. And then the final model is this fractional ownership idea, and this is an idea that has been with us for a long time internationally. In fact, in Sao Paulo, Brazil, this has been happening for a very, very long time, where people actually join together to co-own a vehicle. I think this holds a lot of promise for us, particularly when we look at the suburbs or areas where people own multiple cars, where people could actually reduce the size of their fleet by subleasing their vehicles. These vehicles could also be put into peer-to-peer car sharing settings. So this figure, it looks like it's a little bit cut off there, shows you our data from about a year ago, and the total market size in the Americas, which includes the US, Canada, Mexico, and Brazil, is about 1.15 million members. And you can see from the histogram and the tracking we've been doing since 2002 that this is steady growth. This particular histogram shows how the market shifted between July of 2012 and July of 2013. And what I would note here for you is that in July of 2012, the marketplace was largely comprised of these independent car sharing operators. And Rick actually referred to that. In, I think it was January of 2013, Zipcar was purchased by a rental car company called Avis. And that made a really dramatic change in terms of sort of the distribution. And other independent companies are also being acquired by some of the car rental companies. So you can see that the distribution has changed. The other thing that I would note is you can see that the one-way or point-to-point car sharing service is actually doubled in size in terms of membership. So that has been changing the dynamic as well, since we've been seeing more and more of the point-to-point services coming into the marketplace in North America. This is a vehicle growth chart, and this shows you as of July of 2013, about a year ago, we were at a collective fleet size of about 20,000 vehicles. And again, primarily you're seeing growth, ongoing growth, some dips occasionally, but very few overall. And this is a similar comparative pie chart where you can see in July of 2012, 76% of the overall vehicle share was in the independent market, and then shifting in July of 2013 to the rental car market. I'd also indicate to you that there's a 6 percentage point increase in terms of the size of the vehicle fleet offered by the point-to-point car sharing providers. Next, I want to present some research that we have done in cooperation with the majority and all of the largest car sharing operators in the United States and Canada. We conducted this work in 2008. We had a very substantial survey. You can see 9,500 completed surveys, a very high completion rate, and it was a fairly complex survey which has allowed us to do a lot of analysis. These are all the operators that participated in the study. We did actually have a few others, but their size was so small comparatively, we pulled a few out. This is largely focusing on the neighborhood car sharing application of the classic round trip model. So I'm pulling out anybody who is a college university member or say government fleet member so that we have apples to apples for comparison. And these are the key findings. And those of you who studied car sharing a little bit may be familiar with some of these. So what we found was that each car sharing vehicle across all of these operators in aggregate was removing 9 to 13 vehicles from the road. And this included postponed purchases. We also wanted to find out, well, instead of just getting that 9 to 13 number, how does it differ from actual vehicles sold? So 4 to 6 vehicles out of that 9 to 13 vehicles are actually sold, as opposed to a postponed purchase. The next statistic, which I think is pretty remarkable, I've thought that since I've seen it, is that 25% of the members said they sold a car as a result of car sharing, 25% postponed a car purchase. So that's 50% of the members are either selling a car or postponing a car purchase because of car sharing. I've not seen this in other areas of transportation demand management. It's quite notable. In terms of the net CO2 reduction, we calculated that at approximately 27% reduction. And that's also a good analog for vehicle miles traveled or vehicle kilometers traveled reductions. Now moving into bike sharing, we have essentially 3 flavors of the bike sharing model. So San Francisco has its own bike sharing fleet. You may have seen that, and this is short point-to-point services. And they're typically found at these docking stations, similar to the picture that we see here. But it's not unique just to public bike sharing systems. We see it actually in closed community settings, like campus environments. Companies like Google have their own campus bike system. There's several universities in the United States that have their own closed community bike systems. Hotels are looking into this more and more. And then we even see peer-to-peer bike sharing. And this allows people to actually put their own bikes into a rental or a borrowing type situation and allows people to access those as well. Now, this has never been seen, this chart. This is for a study that's about to be released. We took a lot of time to collect these numbers, and I don't believe they've ever been reported. What I think is very significant for you to see is the total number of users. When you see bike sharing statistics, you never see the total number of users. You'll see the total number of members. That's because tracking the number of users is very challenging with respect to the people who use it on a casual basis. What I think is dramatic here is look at the number of members, 170,000. Look at the number of casual users. It's over 1 million. So the casual users are much larger in terms of their size and scale than the number of dedicated members. Why does this matter? Well, there's been a lot of talk in press about, are these systems sustainable? Do they need public subsidy? Some of the research I'm going to present here today, which has never been presented, actually is a defense of public subsidies for bike sharing. But if you look at that number, you can see that there's an opportunity there from a business model perspective to perhaps be charging more of the casual users, or in the case of City Bike, perhaps a little bit less, and making the business model play out a little bit better. But because these numbers have been somewhat elusive up until this study, we really didn't have a sense of how large the total number of users were relative to the total number of actual members. This is the work that we have just actually completed. I have the final manuscript on my desktop. I have the Minetta Transportation Institute requesting me to get it in so they can release it, so this could be out within a week. Total number of respondents in this particular sample size is over 6,000. We have Bixie in it, Bixie Toronto, So Montreal, Toronto, Nice Ride, Minnesota. We actually have a smaller size system, which was interesting to look at Salt Lake City. And we also have Mexico City's system in this particular study. So what did we find from this particular study? Well, we found that the demographics do tend to skew towards wealthier, more educated, younger, Caucasian, and male users. So Rick also emphasized, I think, in his presentation, I think the need for us to think about a broader user population, more equity-based transportation services, and to keep a keen eye on who the users of these systems actually are. But this is the second major study we've done looking at multiple cities, and we do tend to see the same type of demographics playing out. So perhaps what we need to do is focus a little bit more on how to broaden and mainstream this type of service to a much broader demographic. This is, I'm mixing around a little bit between the two studies. So this was the first study, which included Bixie in Montreal, Toronto, DC, and Minneapolis. And you can see we looked at change in vehicle ownership. We like to see what those statistics look like. Across the board, you can see they're still relatively low. The programs all had been on the ground approximately 1 to 2, well actually in the case of Montreal and Toronto, somewhere around 2 to 3 years, let's say that. I think the average is about a 2% reduction in vehicle ownership. In this particular study, we found that approximately 40% of the members said that they were driving less. In the study that's about to be released, that includes the Mexico City population, we actually saw that increase across those players by 10 percentage points. So 50% of people were saying that they were driving less as a result of bike sharing. So this is the paper that we actually just released. I think it was released in press and the Journal of Transport Geography last week. What we wanted to do was actually take GIS and use it to help us answer some questions about modal shift impacts. So we wanted to see, how this was affecting both rail and bus, how land use might be playing a factor, for instance, the dense urban core as opposed to the suburban periphery. And so what we chose to do is work with our data sets from the 2012 study and hone in on both DC and the Twin Cities. So what we found to be the most dramatic of the results occurred in the case of rail, where we see in the Washington, DC area that the core does seem to be pulling people off of transit. And in the suburban areas, serving as a first mile, last mile connectivity strategy. So essentially, bike sharing is opening up additional capacity in the urban core, particularly during congested periods of time. And as I note in this paper, in speaking with Capital Bikeshare, this was actually their intention, was to help provide relief in that urban core area, have bike sharing serve as a form of public transit, and also serve as a first mile, last mile connector. So those objectives per this GIS analysis were achieved. Interestingly, when we looked into the Twin Cities, which has a much less complex web-like rail design, it's much more of a linear line, rail line, we actually see that people are shifting towards rail, both in the urban core as well as in the peripheral regions. And these are the maps that demonstrate this. And what I want to just indicate to you is that when you look at the red, that tells you a shift away from rail. A yellow is essentially no change in the rail use. And a green is indicating a shift, or I'm sorry, a shift towards rail. The numbers in the center of the donuts are telling you the number of respondents who are reporting. And essentially, when you do the math, which you probably can't do right now, I'd be really impressed if you could, is it spelling out exactly what I explained, is that there's much more of a shift away from rail in the core and much more of a shift towards rail the further you get into the suburban periphery. And this is the rail map for Minneapolis. You can see the dotted line is reflecting the rail line. And overall, we're seeing, again, if you take the donuts and you add it all up, we're seeing a shift towards rail in both the core as well as in the periphery. What are the reasons that people actually used rail less? This was something that we thought was really important to ask in this 2013 survey. Lower cost and faster travel, just faster travel, wanting to get exercise, so there's public health benefits too, and the public transit vehicle is crowded. So those are not surprising results, but they're very important, I think, results to have that go along with the GIS analysis. So shifting over to looking at buses, we do see a little bit of a different story, not necessarily for DC, but for the Twin Cities. In DC, we see the bus shifting is pretty similar to the rail shifting. So you see the shifting away from bus in the core and a little bit more shifting towards bus in the distributed areas. In the Twin Cities, however, we're seeing largely a shift away from bus in both the urban core and the suburban periphery. So the final bullet just indicates that we feel from this analysis that bike sharing could be acting as a bus substitute in the Twin Cities, and in this case does not act so much as a first mile and last mile connector. So there's differences essentially between the impacts on rail and bus. And these maps, again, similar strategy with respect to the analysis. We see, again, a similar story with respect to the shift in bus modal use in the core and in the suburbs in DC. And then here in Minneapolis. So what I want, oh, and Howard, did you want to get that? Okay, I can send you the slide and the paper. So what I wanted to conclude with is that we have a lot of research underway. As I mentioned, the 2013 North American Bikeshare study has just gone through 2 rounds of peer review, is on my computer and is about to be released. We're really excited about that. We have a peer-to-peer car sharing survey, about 1,000 completed members completed it, and it is a national level survey, and it has 3 major peer-to-peer car sharing operators in it, and we hope that will be next on the docket out. We have just concluded an analysis of casual carpooling in conjunction with karmacarpooling.com. Just submitted our first paper to the Transportation Research Board last week, and we have another one. That one is actually focusing on an emissions analysis. We have a second one that's going to be going into another journal focusing on a travel behavior model that we've created using Logit. We have actually just submitted the first, we believe, Transportation Network Company survey paper based on an analysis that a team of us, including Professor Robert Severo, has conducted, and that went into TRB as well. So we hope to share those exciting results with you in January. Working very closely with City Carshare on electric bike sharing linked to car sharing. We're working with Car2Go very closely on a one-way car sharing study funded by the Federal Highway Administration. We're working with many car sharing operators on an insurance risk analysis to provide alternatives to the existing insurance structure. We're also conducting a study on bike sharing safety impacts, and we are continuing our work on car sharing tracking and trends analysis, which we hope to update soon. We're just waiting for one operator to respond, otherwise I would have been able to actually present to you the July numbers. And I wanted to conclude and just leave you with the paper if you want more on the analysis that we just completed on the 2 US bike sharing cities. With that, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Next up is Lori Diggins. Lori is a principal of LDA Consulting, and which is an independent consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. For more than 25 years, she has provided analysis and policy expertise to clients, primarily on transportation policies, and TDM evaluation. She has conducted major regional TDM evaluations in New Jersey, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, North Carolina, and Virginia, and has developed evaluation methods and tools for many TDM agencies. In her projects, Lori has conducted hundreds of surveys and other market research studies to explore regional travel patterns, examine the use of transportation services, and assess their effectiveness in motivating travel behavior change. Today, she will be presenting results of one of those surveys, the Capital Bikeshare's Bikeshare User Survey, conducted in the Washington Metro region. Lori holds a master's in transportation from Northwestern University and a certificate in dispute resolution from Pepperdine Law School. She is the past chair of the Committee for Transportation Demand Management of TRB and has served as a member of several TRB committees. Welcome, Lori.
As I get my presentation, before I even say anything, as I get my presentation up here, I'd like to acknowledge the funders of this research, which are the District Department of Transportation in Washington, D.C., the Arlington County and Capital Bike Arlington, and also the City of Alexandria. Obviously, I can't do two things at once. In the beginning? There we go. Okay. Do I just put... Yes. Okay. Okay, I'm going to be talking to you today about Capital Bikeshare. This is the second survey of Capital Bikeshare members, and it was done in November of 2012. The results are, I will not say dated, because I think they are still quite current. Another survey is planned for this fall. Because many of you might not know about Capital Bikeshare, I'm going to give you a very quick overview. And I meant to put a map in here, but I was quickly throwing this together this morning, just this slide. So I don't have it. Started in August of 2010 as a partnership between the District Department of Transportation and Arlington County, both of which had been either in the process of developing a bike share or had one already going. So that's initial bike share organization was Capital Bikeshare with those two. Now in August of 2012, Alexandria City was added to the mix, and now in May 2013, Montgomery County, Maryland, which is just to the north. So if you think about, if you've ever seen a map of Washington, what you'd see is the central core, this diamond shape, which is the district, Arlington and Alexandria, and then Montgomery County now added to the north. So as we've been hearing, it is very much a core urban type of system at this time. It's operated currently by Alta Bikeshare in partnership with the 4 local governments, as well as some other partners. WABA, I believe, is a partner, ODC Go, a few other organizations that help with marketing and supporting the service. Currently, there are 321 stations with about 2,500 bikes, and as of, I think, April of this year, about 24,000 members. And I will echo what Susan was saying. These are the people who are annual members. This does not include the daily members, which in an area like Washington, of course, would be many with tourists. So I would echo the thought that there are many, many more users of this service than we actually are counting here. Riders can open an annual account. They can buy a 3-day pass or a 1-day, 24-hour pass, a membership. And the other interesting thing is that the first 30 minutes of each ride will be free, and after that there are fees that go up quite a bit. So as I said, this is the second member survey done in November of 2012. There was a survey the previous year. Some similar questions, but some quite new things in this survey. The purpose of the survey was to examine characteristics of members and trips. Very important, look at those travel changes as a big function of this survey. Changes in travel behavior as well as auto ownership and auto use, and customer satisfaction. It was an online survey that was sent out to 11,000 of the members, half of the membership. Now the reason it only went out to half is because at the same time a survey was being done by George Washington University. It was health impacts. Now, what they did agree though, was they added some of our travel questions into their survey, and so we were able to have the overall sample for some questions is close to 7,000, but it is 3,800 for all of the questions. A couple quick things on sample distribution. Compared to all commuters in the DC metro region, and I'm saying commuters, meaning employed people, the Capital Bikeshare members are indeed considerably younger. 63% are under 35. Very, very young population. More likely to be male, more likely to be white, highly educated, slightly affluent, although I think that's primarily related to their younger age, and much more likely not to have a vehicle available. Throughout the region, I believe it's about 6% of households that do not have a vehicle. Among Capital Bikeshare members, it's 46%. So when we think about changing auto ownership, do understand that many of these people, a very large share, come in without a car to begin with. So when I talk about changes in auto ownership, just keep that in mind. One thing I'll note, however, and this was something that Capital Bikeshare was very interested in, is that when we compare the results from the early members, the people who joined in, say, the first 3 to 6 months, the population is becoming younger, but otherwise more demographically diverse. More females, a lower income generally, and fewer people who are now white. So it is an interesting demographic shift over time, and Capital Bikeshare has made a concerted effort to get the word out, the membership availability, as well as the benefits of membership to that broad audience. The other thing I would note is that we are seeing a greater number of people who do not have either a personal vehicle or a personal bike. And so that has been a shift. So you're sort of thinking about this service now becoming popular with people who have no other personal travel options. In the survey, we asked about two things. We asked about typical Bikeshare use, and we asked about also your most recent use, because we wanted to be able to try to get some snapshot. Members use Capital Bikeshare most often for non-work trips. If you look at the green bars, this is people who are using it occasionally or frequently. We asked people to rate on a scale of 1 to 5. How often do you use Capital Bikeshare for each of these uses? Now the ones at the bottom you can see are work-related trips. One of the interesting things here that was very different from the Zipcar survey that I did in 2008 for the capital region was that the number of people who are using Bikeshare to get to work. This was an eye-opener for me, because with the round-trip car share, it was not a commute mode. It just wasn't. And to see that almost 60% of members said they use Capital Bikeshare to get to work, and 40% said they use it often, that was a really striking result. But of course, social entertainment, errands, personal trips, etc. do make up a very large component. On average, when we asked how many trips did you make last month, average was about 8.6 trips. But it was distributed across all frequencies, from people who said, oh, I use it once or twice, to people who said, I'm using it 40 times a month. So we did see a market for Bikeshare that ranged across a wide range of frequencies. The other thing that was also notable, and Susan touched on this, was the use of Bikeshare to get to transit. 54% of all of the surveyed respondents said they had used Capital Bikeshare at least once in the past month to access Metro Rail, and 23 had used it to access a bus. Interestingly, we have commuter rail in the Washington region. 9% said they used it to access commuter rail. Now, I will tell you that almost certainly that is people accessing it in the core to go home, taking Bikeshare, say, to Union Station. But it is still, again, that access function that allows them to use that first mile, last mile. We asked why they chose Bikeshare for their most recent trip. And for the most recent trip, what we found, and I've highlighted those dark orange bars, bike is faster and easier to the destination. Top reason, 78% of people said that was, now obviously this is multiple response options, but 42% said it was too far to walk to where I was going. So now that means they might have taken a different mode to get to that location, or as you'll find out in a moment, they might not have made that trip at all. 30% said they wanted to get exercise. So those were the top 3 reasons. When we looked at the reasons by age group, we saw a really big difference. Members who were under 35 tended to give reasons that were related to lack of a vehicle. They said, it's too far to walk, transit is unavailable, I don't have a car. When we looked at people who were over 45, and I'll leave that middle group out here for a moment, people who were over 45 gave reasons that were related to disadvantages of driving. So they had a car, but they chose not to use it because the bike share was, they didn't want to drive to that destination, or at that time of day, it was too much traffic, parking was a problem. So you can think about, you have 2 distinct markets. You have the market that doesn't have another way to get there. But you have the market that has a car, but they're saying, this is better for this trip, better for this destination, better for this time of day. And you see in that sidebar, what mode would they have chosen for that trip if Capital Bikeshare had not been available? 44% would have said, I would have taken transit. 38% said they would have walked. 6% would have used a taxi. So it is, again, to me that's not a shared ride vehicle, that is a personal vehicle. Personal bike would have been 5%, and personal car was 4%. So most of these people would have looked for some other option. But indeed, that, especially that over 45 group, liked the idea that this gave them a non-driving option. We asked about trips that were induced, meaning it's a trip you would not have taken if Bikeshare had not been available. 40% of all members said they had made at least one induced trip in the past month, and they had made on average 1.8 trips. When you compare that to the 8.6 number of trips that were made last month, these induced trips were 21% of all the trips. So these are trips that, again, would not have been made at all. Now, if you compare the yellow bars, which are the same as I showed a moment ago about how often do you use this for any of these trip types, and you look at the green bars, which are the induced trips, they actually, excuse me, they actually do track relatively closely, obviously a smaller share, but in proportion. So it's not one single kind of trip that's being replaced or being induced. It does cover a quite wide range of trip types. The one I've highlighted there is this going to or from work. Now, I don't know about you, but most of us don't have work trip as a discretionary option. But we looked at that, and I actually puzzled over that for a while. And my theory is these are people maybe who are going to work on a Saturday or a Sunday, and maybe they said, I would not have gone to the office. I would not have gone back to the office in the evening if this had not been an option for me. So it might be more that kind of a trip. Now, I showed you a moment ago why people use Capital Bikeshare. We asked the same question, why did you use it for that induced trip? And the numbers here are a little bit different. Here you can see the top reason is too far to walk, 61%. Yes, bike is faster, easier, etc. Those still were reasons. But what this suggested to us is that people might be replacing a distant location, a nearby location with something that they preferred to do for that same trip purpose, but it was farther away. So instead of going to a restaurant a block away, that new place that was 20 blocks away, I took Capital Bikeshare. So we're seeing here that this is expanding the options, the range of options, and the distance that people can go. An interesting question on the survey was, if a business, restaurant, or shop is easily accessible by Capital Bikeshare, does that access make you more or less likely to patronize the establishment? Now, I was really puzzled. What is that 4% of people who said they're less likely because Capital Bikeshare is in front? I don't understand it, unless those are people who are thinking, well, it's taking away the parking that I could have used. But we did see that 85% of people said Capital Bikeshare access made them more likely to patronize an establishment. And there is, by the way, a website, it's not Capital Bike Shares, but I ran across it. It's a restaurant website. And one of the things they put as amenities is it Capital Bike Share accessible? That was very interesting to see that. But 37% said they were much more likely to patronize a Capital Bike Share establishment. And we did see, when we looked at how many induced trips were those people making, the people who said they were much more likely, indeed, were making almost twice as many induced trips as the people who even said they were somewhat more likely or not much more, not more likely. So it's not just word, what's the word? I can't think of it. Mouth. They're really they're walking the talk. They're walking the walk. Whatever it is. They're riding the bike. Okay. A couple quick things on travel changes. We asked about use of various modes, more or less the same. We asked about car ownership. We asked about driving, and we asked about commuting. So I'm going to give you a quick one on each of those. 50% of members said they had reduced their personal car use. Now remember that this does take into account people who never had a car before. So they might be Carshare members. So it's a little bit different, I think, than some of the Carshare numbers. But we did see at the bottom here, 50% of people saying they drive a car less, 60% saying they taxi less, but 61% said they ride Metro Rail less, 52% said they use a bus less, and 54% walk less. What is this meaning? It means that Bikeshare does reduce car use, but it also steals from other modes. That's a bad way of saying it, perhaps, because it's just adding another option, so that for some trips, this is a better option than others. Now, when we asked about, did you reduce a household vehicle, and I was interested in the Carshare numbers, because we asked a two-part question. Have you reduced, since you joined Capital Bikeshare, have you sold a personal household vehicle or considered selling it? And if they said yes, we asked them, did you replace that vehicle? So what we found here, as you can see, 5% said they sold a vehicle and did not replace it. 2% said, well, I did sell a vehicle, but yeah, I bought another one. So we discounted them. 7% said they considered it. This is, I think, similar to the postponing it, although a little bit different in that respect. So what we're looking at this 5% of what we had an actual reduction in car ownership. And for half of these members, it was the only vehicle. So you think about becoming car free versus car light. You have two and you get rid of one. Well, half of this smallish group, but half of them got rid of the only vehicle that they owned. It's a little bit of a complicated chart, but we looked at driving distance, driving miles. We asked a question of how many miles do you drive before Bikeshare, how many do you drive after, and we compared it. Now we only included in this number the people who could give us both a before and after. Some people could not. But on average, the people who could give us a number was 1,800 before and about 1,600 after. So on average, they reduced about 200 miles. Okay. But when you multiply that by the 22,000 Bikeshare members, what we have is 4.4 million fewer driving miles each year. And now this could mean that someone is not using Carshare, that now they're biking instead of using Carshare. It's not necessarily their own personal vehicle. We asked about rental cars, every kind of car that they might be driving. And last on the traffic changes, 38% of members made a continued change in their primary commute mode. Now I will point out here that only 12% of Bikeshare members say they drive alone to work now. Again, urban audience, many don't have cars, but 25% said they increased bike use for as their primary mode to get to work. So we saw a big increase there. Last thing, a couple of quick slides on why do people join Carshare? What do they get out of it? These were the reasons, again, multiple response options were permitted. The primary reasons for joining were that they could get around easier, faster, shorter time. That was 91% of people gave that response. A new option, a new one-way option, that is key. One-way travel was so important. I like to bike. That was a little interesting to me that 3/4 said, I joined because I like to bike. It's fun. It's a fun way to get around, exercise, save money, environmental concerns, top things. Younger members, interestingly, were motivated by ease of getting around and saving money. Top 3 there, too. Older members were people who said, I get exercise, I'm environmentally concerned, and I'm concerned about health. So again, primarily at the younger age, I don't have another way to travel. This gives me a new option. On average, members are saving about $800 per year on personal travel costs. So another big benefit, and this is one that Capital Bikeshare certainly is promoting, because the membership is what, $75, Chris, is that right? $75 a year. So it pays in 2 months for the average person. Last 2 slides, a couple of quick quotes on member comments. Freedom, flexibility, fun, spontaneous, etc., etc. But if you look down the list, some of the things that really were highlighted for me were dock it and forget it. It's one way, convenience, not having to worry about bike parking, theft of my personal bike. So even people who have a personal bike were choosing Bikeshare because they just didn't have to worry about leaving their bike somewhere. Access to areas that are not served by bus. The buses are crowded. Again, looking back, that this is indeed a transit type of service that extends other types of transit. And then last, we did a word cloud on what members liked most about. and when I gave this first presentation, someone said, well, you've repeated convenience. And I said, well, some people capitalized it, some people didn't. But if you look there, you see convenient, convenience, convenience, over and over. If there's one mantra here, it's a convenient way to get around. And that was absolutely the primary thing I think that people saw in Bikeshare. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them with the others. And I will also, Chris, what's the Capital Bikeshare website? Is it capitalbikeshare.com? The full survey results and the report and everything is posted there for both the 2011 and 2012 surveys.
Okay, so we've heard about car sharing, we've heard about bike sharing, now you're going to hear about ride sharing. Just share a few slides with the group on things that are going on with the ride share. So as many of you know, there's a new way to access what some folks are calling ride sharing, and this is through the sharing economy, and emphasis has been on access rather than ownership. And there are a number of what I'm going to call shared use mobility apps that are out there, including Karma, Lyft, Relay Rides. Ride Scout is an aggregator of many of these services. There's also Sidecar and Uber, and probably others that are not on this list. What I found is that there's probably one of these new services coming out almost every other day. You read about something. So we've, at the Council of Governments, we put together a task force, a shared ride use mobility task force, to look at several issues on these providers. Including the legality of these services, what are the current definitions of ride sharing, what are current and proposed regulations, and the status of those regulations. We looked at regulatory requirements for providers, and they've been pretty much complex and evolving. And when we look at the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia, they're all on different spheres in terms of how they're going to address this issue. And some of this has caused tension in many urban areas across the country on whether the providers should be subject to the same regulations as the taxi cab providers. And then the other issue is the hijacking, or what I'm going to call the hijacking of the word rideshare. Is it true to form? So, the current definition of ride sharing in the District of Columbia is that there is no definition. However, the DC Taxi Cab Commission has proposed regulations that has a definition, and it's basically an activity not subject to licensing or regulation by the Commission, in which passengers are grouped for a non-commercial purpose, such as defraying costs, reducing road congestion, decreasing fuel use, protecting the environment, and increasing ridership, in which no person has a for-profit interest. So this recommendation would create a definition for ride sharing for the Commission's regulations only, but not one of general applicability across the District of Columbia, which I found very interesting. In Maryland, there is a definition on the books, as there are definitions all across the country, and there is a publication that was a TCRP publication that was put out back in the late 1990s that actually outlines whether or not a state has a definition of ride sharing. And several states do have a specific definition. So in general, the definition in Maryland is that it's a nonprofit commuting service used in transporting commuters exclusively between the residents and their place of employment, and then it goes on to define what type of passenger car it needs to be, and then it also has a specific definition for van pools and how those need to be operated. In Virginia, there's also a ride-sharing arrangement definition. It means the transportation of persons in a motor vehicle when such transportation is incidental to the principal purpose of the driver, which is to reach a destination and not to transport persons for profit. And of course this includes carpools, van pools, and bus pools. So the DC Taxi Cab Commission basically created a panel on industry back in the spring of 2013 when many of these services started up operations, and they actually enacted an emergency act, which basically sets specific criteria to allow the temporary operations of these services. However, they also basically listed out a number of issues that needed to be addressed by these services, many of which were basically not adhered to, even though there was an agreement. One case in particular was that many of these services were asked to provide insurance information, and when the Commission got the documentation, much of that information in terms of who the provider was redacted from the document. So that right there just raised a lot of red flags for many people. The Act established basic rules to allow ride-sharing these services to operate temporarily. They had to submit proof that they were licensed to do business in DC. They had to maintain a registered agent in DC and also have a website that provided customer service information. And they had to also have excess liability insurance that provides a minimum of $1 million per incident coverage for accidents involving the vehicle and operator during one of these trips. The panel also has proposed regulations to modify the public vehicle for hire section, and they're defining these services as a public vehicle for hire service that uses digital dispatch to connect passengers with non-professional drivers operating with their own personal vehicles, and really wanted to state that the service does not include ride sharing the way that we know it, and they are looking to choose an appropriate name for the service. Now what's happened, and many of you probably know, here in California, they're calling these services transportation network companies, and our feeling is that that's probably the way that's going to migrate in DC as well. There have been several public hearings, and also there have been meetings with the providers, and there also have been meetings with the taxi cab industry. And currently where everything stands is that it's kind of in a holding pattern, and the latest that we've heard is that the DC City Council is expected to make some type of a ruling in September. But there's also been a call by the DC Council to basically reorganize the entire DC Taxi Cab Commission. So that could very well happen as well. So we'll stay tuned on that. In Maryland, there were two bills that were introduced this past legislative session, none of which were supported by the Maryland Public Service Commission. Both bills failed, mainly because the providers would have been considered as smartphone app providers and not transportation for hire companies. So now what's happened is that there's been an issue of a proposed order to regulate these services. However, this order has now been appealed by Uber, and it's kind of in a holding situation until they decide where they need to go with it. In Virginia, the DMV issued a cease and desist order to all of these services on June 5th of this year. And publicly, these organizations have basically vowed to disregard the order, and they're just continuing to provide their services. And while many of the police enforcement groups in Northern Virginia are not out looking for rideshare I guess these shared ride use services violations, there have been a few drivers that have been ticketed, but they've been pulled over for other types of traffic violations. So what's happening now is that the DMV is going to be studying the issue, and they want to come up with some type of a business model to encourage these services, but they also want these folks to come to the table so that they can work jointly. Where that all stands right now is unclear. So there have been a number of other areas, and honestly, as we're speaking, this could be changing. In fact, the other day, I just sitting, read the paper, and right on the front page there was a little notice on the business section that in New York City, Lyft was promising to pay drivers $10,000 a month for 60 hours a week. Just say hours. In California, the PUC has, even though they put out regulations, those have now been changed. Colorado is the only state that I'm aware of that has passed actual state legislation. In Illinois, I know that the taxi cab industry has sued the city. Where that lawsuit stands is unclear at this point. I know that in Texas there's been a restraining order injunction hearing that was going to be held to stop providers from operating or give city ordinances a chance to catch up with the technology. I'm not sure where that stands at this point, but if anybody has any updates, I know several of you are following these particular, feel free to speak up. And then in Miami, Uber announced that they would be paying any $1,000 tickets received by their drivers. So they're basically disregarding any type of laws that are there. And then in Seattle, I believe that there were some regulations that were passed by the city council, but now that's been challenged by the public, and they're basically pushing to get it on a referendum in the fall.
Update.
Is there an update? Okay, so there you go.
They put a new deal in place between the city and the providers, so the providers are dropping the referendum campaign.
Okay.
They came up with a new compromise.
Okay, so that must have happened recently.
Last 3 weeks.
Okay, so I think from our standpoint as an industry, I think there are some legal issues that we need to be looking at. First and foremost is the name ride sharing itself for public vehicle for hire services. As many of you know that have been in this industry for a long time, we basically are of the opinion that that these are not for-profit types of arrangements. Insurance is important. And the insurance industry has stepped up and basically said that these services do not fall within the scope of coverage in an ordinary personal liability policy. And there are also safety concerns. You're getting amateur drivers out there who may not be up to speed with how they need to be driving other passengers. Particularly if they're not people that are not related to them, or they don't know who these people are. The training's not there, but I also think this puts the taxi cab industry on notice too, that they need to be doing a better job. And I think everyone in this room would agree. I think there's a place for these services, and I'm not advocating that these services not be allowed to operate, but there need to be some parameters put in place for many of these services. Some other issues, the whole digital dispatch issue, and the tax in the street hails. I think that needs to be addressed. And then also addressing the disabled community, and also I think it was mentioned earlier that many of these services don't service the low-income community as well, and so I think if this is going to be a viable way of mobility, it needs to be all-encompassing, and that really hasn't happened. And with that, I'm going to open it up to. I'd like to have all of our panelists just stand up here because we are recording this, and so if you have a question, we're going to repeat the question, and then we'll have the panelists basically answer the question. So, open for questions. We'll wait on the applause.
I've got a comment, but I also have a question. The comment is in regards to Chicago and Illinois. The city and the state have put up two different bills, letters of legislation to actually limit it based on home rule. So home rule is if you're a city with give or take 25,000 people, the city can actually, that local municipality can actually set their own terms. Otherwise, it's defaulted to the actual state. With that being said, the city of Chicago is working with the taxi industry, or at least trying to get everybody on board, to have a comparative limit between both the transportation network company and whether or not you can actually go full-time or part-time drivers, and actually setting those limits. And currently those bills haven't been, they've not been passed yet. They're still up for grabs in their respective chambers.
Okay.
With that being said, have any of you experienced any participation or input between your bike share or your shared use mobility with, like, say, the transit agencies to create some kind of multi-use function? So whether or not you're doing transit to bike share, whether or not there's deals that are involved with for the consumer to actually use multiple uses of transit.
Okay, so the question is, has the bike share, car share industry coordinated with the transit agency to have some type of a shared use program? Anyone?
Yes, this has definitely occurred in both car sharing and bike sharing. In the case of car sharing, there's been a lot of partnership with respect to placement of the vehicles at transit stations, for example. In the case of Chicago, Sharon Fagan was a pioneer in connecting the iGo car sharing service to the transit operator FarePass, and she worked really tirelessly on that, and it would be great to see that replicated in other areas. And of course, in the bike sharing space, we've seen a lot of partnerships between the public transit operators and the bike sharing operators to co-locate with each other. We've also seen innovations in areas like Transit Screen, where you see in local shops screens that give you on an LCD co-location of the bike pods along with transit information. So there's been a lot of, I think, connectivity as well as enterprise from third parties that I've seen. But we can do more, for sure.
Thanks. Other questions? I know the young lady here in the front, you had a question earlier, and I didn't mean to cut you off, but did you have a question for Rick?
The question was, is the access mobile work to commute only, all commutes?
Okay, so is access mode for all commutes?
The Access Mobile program actually looks at those vehicles as part of our total of our car sharing network. So any of our members, of our 16,000 members, can use those vehicles at any time, 24/7. We do give a preference to people who have self-identified. And we have a lot of users of those vehicles. Not everybody chooses to self-identify, but if they do, then they'll get a preference on when they can use it. And what we've seen is that those vehicles tend to be used quite heavily on weekends for longer periods of time, and not as much during commute times.
Question?
This one's for Susan. You talked a lot about how you're studying the greenhouse gas reductions out of a number of these shared uses, and other than traditional car sharing, there hasn't been a whole lot done yet. I'm interested, especially given the car services enabled by technology, like an Uber and a Lyft. Has there been a comparative study on GHG reduction out of the taxi industry that could possibly be used as a point of comparison?
So, question about whether or not the taxi industry has a GHG emission-related study. To my knowledge, there is not something along those lines. I will give you a little bit of a preview of the work that UC Berkeley has just done. We actually tried to do the best we could to do a matched pair analysis of trips taken by TNCs, or these on-demand ride services, alongside of the taxi. And our study does not go so far as to calculate the GHG emission impacts. That's actually a very, very complex analysis. Ours is documented, and it's a multi-page analysis for the car sharing. We are going to go forward and do a very sophisticated GHG analysis for bike sharing based off of the 2012 data set.
Other questions? Yeah, in the back.
This is actually a comment more than a question, but here in San Francisco, I mean, the taxi ordinance that was adopted 5 years ago does require cab companies to reduce GHG emissions by 50% over 1990 levels, and that has been more or less carried out.
Okay, so there's an ordinance here in San Francisco requiring cab companies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50%.
Right.
Okay. But by what time frame? So,
By now. And
by now,
2012,
okay.
I think.
all right, Larry.
Yeah, so a general question, particularly for Susan and Lori. One of the things that struck me, it was pretty amazing, the information that you had, Susan, about the percentage of members versus occasional users. And that raises the issue of all of these surveys, whether by just looking at members, or whether or not the results you're getting really pertain to the overall use of bike share and how that impacts the relationship between bike share and transit and others. And particularly when you get to the issue of what's the impact on core transit usage, because it may very well be that there is a very different impact. And are you planning to look at that issue?
That's a really good question, Larry, so thank you. So the question was related to, in the case of bike sharing, there's a lot of members, but they're almost an order of magnitude more casual members. And so Larry was asking about the study of the casual user. So it's actually as part of our 2012 survey, which included again the Mexico and Salt Lake City cases along with Montreal and Toronto, we did attempt to do a QR code where people could actually respond. The response rate, except for one city, was remarkably low. So I report on it because I think it's an experimental methodology that we should learn from. But we have actually just done a clipboard survey in San Francisco of casual users. We've just completed the data collection, and we will be examining it from an impact perspective to get a better understanding of it. And I do believe Ralph Bueller did some similar work with the Capital Bikeshare system in maybe a year or two ago around the casual users. So I do think we need to have a better understanding. I was quite surprised actually at the numbers when we actually got them in from all the operators, that the number of casual users was basically an order of magnitude greater than members.
I'll add that as far as the Capital Bikeshare program is concerned, I know that there's a survey that will be done this year. We've talked about different aspects of what other things might be measured. And one of the things we talked about was getting a better handle on visitor travel. But it's of course more difficult to survey those people, as Susan says, even with the QR code, than it is with people who are annual members. The other thing I point out though is if someone is a tourist and they're a one-time user, are they as valuable in your impact calculation individually as, say, an annual user who's using it 6, 8, 10 times a month? And I would argue that they probably are not. On the other hand, if you have a lot of them, 1 penny here, 1 penny there. So getting an idea of what a typical visitor, one-time user is. And I think Washington, I don't know if Washington is unique in the number of visitors that we get, certainly not compared to San Francisco or any other big city. But getting an idea of what a typical visitor would otherwise be doing, I think is important, and being able to factor that in.
Okay, one more question. Sure.
One of my concerns with the TNCs is that it's actually pulling trips from biking, walking, and transit and inducing car trips, therefore increasing VMT and greenhouse gas emissions and having a negative impact on TDM. I'm just curious, any of your thoughts on that?
Well, I think certainly from a regional perspective, one of the things we're charged with is basically looking at vehicle trips travel, vehicle miles of travel, and then also looking at how that impacts all of our emissions for the entire region. And yeah, that is of concern. I know from an MPO standpoint, it's a concern. I don't know if anybody else would like to comment on that. It's something we're going to be closely monitoring. For those that are interested in the latest status, there is a session later this afternoon that I would encourage you to attend regarding the whole transportation network or shared use mobility app situation. And for those of you who would like to see this session again, we'll have it up on the TDMI website in case you missed something. But all of our panelists will be here afterwards, and we're more than happy to answer any questions. And let's just give a round of applause to the Thank you.
Yeah, sure.